Since the dawn of civilization, the community has been central to human society. It is where we live, work, play, learn, grow, bond, and when that's all finished, it is also where we die. The community is also the embodiment of humanity's natural tendency to form societies in order to survive and thrive. Without communities, we would not be the humans we are today. Communities have evolved immensely over the centuries, but the two biggest contributors to large shifts in the structure and scale of them have been emerging technologies and changes in social systems, both manifesting in changes to the modes of production. We saw this before with the transition to capitalism. Never before capitalism had existed large, multi-million population metropoli where people drive cars from A to B, largely foregoing the horse and cart. Today we face many challenges that necessitate once again a change in our society and the way we conduct ourselves economically. Additionally, there are massive opportunities and potentials with regards to achieving sustainable abundance that could be realised given the right preconditions are met. In order to realise the changes needed to build a free, sustainable, abundant world, a big thing we need to consider is what the communities of the future could look like. And that is what I will be going over today. Let's establish a starting point. Today, the communities people live in today. What are they like? What's wrong with them? And how do they contribute to many of our current problems? When we look at the communities of today, we have to take into consideration that they are structured, figuratively and literally, to fit and work within the capitalist model of society and economy. Most people live in cities, and these cities are planned not around sustainability or public health, but around the creation of jobs and satisfying private interests. In a somewhat reductive summary, cities are planned so that people have places to work, places to live, though they're often not very good at doing that, places to shop, some public services like schools and maybe a functioning hospital, and not much else. How do people get around to and from these places? Most of the time, you guessed it, by car. Unless you live in one of the few cities that actually cares about public transport and cycling. Is there much social/community infrastructure? You bet there isn't. In many ways, modern cities are damaging to human physical and mental health, and to the health of the ecosphere. Global car dependency leads to urban sprawl, underinvestment where it's often needed, see commuter towns, and is a significant contributor to climate change. It is also a contributor to health issues such as obesity, as walking is often impractical, especially if someone has to take a job that is on the other side of town from where they live. The common lack of community infrastructure leads to atomization, loneliness, and a deterioration of people's mental health, and could even cause a breakdown of community cohesion and collaboration. Adding on to this, public services are often barely adequate and are very limited in scope. As I alluded to earlier, the communities of today chronically fail to adequately address issues such as homelessness, despite having ample space to house everyone. And, on top of that, something I will explain later, is that the way modern cities and communities are designed is just plain dumb. How would communities in a sustainable post-scarcity society be different? Well, let's look at some of my inspirations as well as some concepts from some movements I've been aligned with for some time now. And in my opinion, archaic term for the type of society I think we should transition to is a resource-based economy. It is what organisations like the Zeitgeist movement, who I've been involved with for a while now, are best known for advocating. and the idea was conceived by engineer and architect Jacques Fresco of the Venus Project. Fresco also designed new cities to accompany his idea for a new social system. I have both praise and critique for his designs and conceptions. I think the idea of having a community be physically structured in a radial fashion makes more sense than a grid system. Why? Well, transport systems are less resource and energy intensive simply because they don't have to travel as far. Again, because you don't need to go back on yourself to get to where you need to go in a lot of cases. For things like trains, this is handy because you can do things like run a continuous train service that, for example, runs around the outer rim of the city, and you can do that continuously without having to change direction. Stoppages are also reduced, and wait times would be more consistent. It would also aid walkability, especially in the centre of the community. Other areas of praise I have for Fresco's designs is the integrated energy generation and self-sustainability, such as each community having its own agriculture. This minimises food miles, ensures food security, and decentralises power generation. This clearly mirrors the vision of having all resources declared the common heritage of humanity. Also incorporated in the designs are abundant, lush natural surroundings, which also create a sense of peace and privacy, which complements the walkable/cyclable path planning. There's also places to relax for recreation and so on. The design is efficient but also very human and nature-centered. I have one big pet peeve with the Venus Project's designs, however. Housing. Modern cities regularly inhabit hundreds of thousands of people, and regardless of social system, aside from maybe eco-fascism, but I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, that isn't going to change. Here is some concept art from the Venus Project. You are simply not going to house 100k plus people in a city that looks like this. We don't have to dig too deep to realise the reason for this conception of housing though. Most of this was designed in 70s USA, where the concept of the single family home American dream of the 50s was still a thing Americans very much believed in and clinged on to. So I understand the appeal. Times have changed, however, and we more desperately need solutions to housing that adequately homes people in a reasonable density while also being sustainable, being good for public health, and providing people with a variety of amenities and access to points of interest. There's a real-life example of this that has existed for over 100 years. It is, in my view, the envy of the world in terms of social housing. I am of course talking about Viennese social apartment blocks. Take a look at this clip for more. Credit to the original creator.
Here in Vienna, 2/3 of its citizens live in subsidised social housing. But in the UK, less than 1 in 10 live in a council house. And not only that, the quality and style is simply out of this world.
So is this what you think of when you think of council housing?
This is Alt Erla, a social housing estate on the outskirts of Vienna. It may look like tough brutalist architecture, but actually it's humane, caring design of the highest order.
Oh wow, look at that. They've even got an indoor swimming pool as well.
They have nurseries, schools and tennis courts all conveniently on site. I can't quite believe this.
This is about long-term thinking, allowing people to put down roots, giving them stability. I mean, just imagine if I proposed a high-density council housing estate with loads of swimming pools, indoor and outdoor, clubs, play spaces. I'd be left out of town. because everybody would see you couldn't do that.
With 10,000 residents, Alt-Urla has the highest density living in Vienna. But you'd never guess that from the peaceful atmosphere.
Now, in our realised post-scarcity world, housing doesn't have to look exactly like this. But this is a shining example of how it's possible to create a type of housing that anyone can live in and have access to integrated amenities that benefit the well-being of its inhabitants in a relatively high density. And as we segue into talking about how to build better future communities, that's probably a good starting point. Density. In my view, among the view of some modern urbanists, places like suburbs and spread out cities are too low density. They often require cars for transport, which encourages urban sprawl and the fragmentation of community. However, I also think that many modern large cities are a bit too dense, not necessarily in how they're planned out, although that's certainly a factor, but how centralised large cities are. In terms of things like city density, you can in fact be too dense, as was the case with Kowloon Walled City. People basically lived on top of each other. Violence was high, living standards were poor, black markets emerged. It wasn't a very nice place to live. But thankfully, cities don't need to be this dense in order to be sustainable. Good community planning may naturally gravitate towards higher densities, but density for density's sake shouldn't always be chased after. The reason why we don't need cities like Kowloon in order to be sustainable and provide high living standards for all is because for many countries, hardly any land is built upon. There is more than enough land for us to reshape communities and build new ones. So what, we just carve up all the countryside? Not exactly. Remember how I mentioned modern cities being highly centralised in population and economy? Well, that creates a few problems. In my country, the UK, many of the jobs, national points of interest, etc. are located in one city. You guessed it, London. This means that a crap ton of people commute to and from London every single day. A lot of these commuters travel to and from the city by car. What if, instead of having large, centralised cities that are largely segregated from the natural world, we try something different? What if, instead, we had networks or webs of towns of similar size, not separate from the natural world, but in symbiosis with it, all with smart urban design, integrated biodiversity, fully resourced common amenities and public services, low noise pollution, low actual pollution, places to socialise, to share ideas and innovate, and more? Let's talk specifics on imagining the communities of the future. Foregoing the grid system, future communities should instead opt for a radial structure to reduce sprawl, increase the efficiency of transport, and for communities to be able to support both a human economy and society and local biodiversity. This would also encourage community engagement in the form of activities and events, particularly in the centre, as it's the place where everyone lives in radial proximity to. Rather than centralised metropolises, what we can instead have is populations more distributed across smaller, more decentralised but more connected towns and cities, which also incorporate aspects of nature such as woodland, wildlife, that sort of thing. This would make for a society that is both more connected with nature and with each other. Smaller numbers of people per community, especially in radial communities, allows for easier formation of local social groups and culture, as everyone is more able to more closely interact with each other, as opposed to everyone being surrounded by a sea of strangers, in the case of a large centralised city. When it comes to housing, there are various ways that we could approach it. However, these approaches must be constrained with a few guidelines. Residential areas should be planned densely but also provide privacy to individuals. They should respect and even enhance local ecosystems. They should allow people easy access to vital services and amenities, and should facilitate mutual aid and community, which can take various forms, such as having large communal kitchens where people cook for each other on top of people's smaller personal kitchens. Even in an access over ownership scenario, where you live is still very much your own personal space. I've had some people in adjacent communities suggest things like people living in dorm rooms or in similar arrangements, which strikes me as something that not a lot of people would be enthusiastic about. A form of hyper-communal living would save space, but that's about where the benefits end. The thing is, people need their own little sanctuary from the outside world, from people they don't know too closely. This is part of what a home provides. On the flip side, we shouldn't replicate atomized American suburbia either, for obvious reasons, and it's impossible to give everyone a 100-acre plot away from everyone else. We can take inspiration from the Viennese apartments I mentioned earlier in this video, but we can make modifications to expand the provisions of the buildings and also make them work within a radial community structure. The apartments themselves should be made big enough to provide a high standard of living, but not so big that demand couldn't be met within a given target density. If we design them right, we can even give people a considerable amount of personal outdoor space, either in the form of large balconies or in the form of terraces, where one apartment's garden acts as the roof of the one below. The benefit of doing this is that it provides the benefits of a house without being constrained to the ground level, which would impact the viability of increasing density. Terraced or staggered apartments like this would leave a gap in the centre of the building, as the structure is tapered. This space could be occupied by services and amenities like common rooms, gyms, learning centres, libraries, clinics, and so on. These blocks of apartments shouldn't be any more than 10 to 15 stories high, but can be any size up to that. Otherwise you run into problems such as the elevator problem, where there's simply never enough lifts in the building. The costs of HVAC, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, every additional floor thereafter also goes up considerably because of the differences in the ability for heat to enter and escape the building between the low and high levels. And once you get to skyscraper height, you have to start thinking about things like structural support, mechanical load balancing, things of that nature, which adds additional material cost and complexity. And you don't really get any benefits in terms of density, because the taller your skyscraper is, typically the more space you need at the bottom, either as a base to support the structure or to accommodate the sheer number of people entering and exiting the building every single day. That's why a big thing with modern urbanists is mid-rise, mid-density buildings that are dense enough to accommodate a lot of people, but at the same time don't come with the complications of a skyscraper, which is where the 10 to 15 story figure comes from. In the apartment blocks, something we could also do as a nice touch is to prioritise bottom floors for disabled people and the elderly for accessibility purposes. Do bear in mind that there's nothing stopping people in this scenario from building their own home out in nature if they wish to. However, that housing will always be there for them should they need it. But people don't just need places to live, they need also places to create and innovate, to produce and share. In the context of a gift economy, where we have forgone markets and the hierarchical enterprise structure, individuals and companies in the form of cooperatives, collective organisations, etc., all part of the collaborative commons, would become the primary forms of productive organisation. All these people and groups need places to, well, do what they do. In this vein, an idea for future communities I have is for there to be common enterprise centres situated in the inner belts of a radial community. These would provide space for offices, workshops, distribution centres and outlets, and more. This would look kind of similar to how a shopping centre looks today, except without the shopping part. Free from rent and utility bills, people could use these spaces to bring their dreams to reality, for real this time, unlike under monetary capitalism. The centre of each community could be used for whatever its inhabitants choose, but is likely to be some kind of town hall, a monument, or a central meeting place, or some kind of other hub or significant point of interest, or maybe a vital service such as a large hospital. Residential areas are likely to be combined with lush green spaces and places of leisure, such as swimming pools and tennis courts, and it would probably be beneficial to have residential areas on the outer belts to provide the highest capacity. On the perimeter of each community could be much of its agriculture and energy generation, in addition to things like rooftop solar and underfloor geothermal if the locale can provide it. Communities of the future would produce as much of what they need as possible, their own food, energy, building materials, textiles, medicine, and so on. I'm not ignoring the fact that some resources are unique to specific locations. We can use some form of cross-communal or cross-regional barter in such cases. This could perhaps be achieved more effectively though through a resource balancing component of a resource management system. Regardless, communal self-sufficiency has its perks: security of resources, direct access to them, and more democratic control of resources by the community and its members. As we transition more and more from mining raw materials to recycling those already used, interregional dependence on minerals lessens, which further aids in localization of production and resource democracy. Something that could be done to save some space if a community conducts heavy industry is to place such facilities underground. Intensive vertical farms could also employ this technique of having multiple subterranean floors with natural sunlight carried to them via things like fibre optics or mirrors in order to increase production within a given footprint. Said heavy industry, in a post-scarcity future, would also be likely heavily automated, and automation solutions could be more or less prevalent in the community depending on what the people of said community choose. A community may have automated factories, but could also employ solutions to maintain tidiness and decrease pollution, such as having robots pick up litter and maintain foliage, for example. In any case, automation should be applied where it is beneficial and appropriate to do so. Superfluous automation could potentially be a drain on physical resources. Automation is fine when it's used for things humans don't really want to do. However, I think people may worry that robots are taking over their lives if we employ automation solutions to compete with human passions, such as art or research, on a mass scale. I am aware modern algorithms already do this to an extent, but not without compiling huge amounts of inputs created by humans first, which is an important detail. Moving away from automation in future communities, I wanted to quickly address transport. I already made a video explaining my opinions on what I think should be done about transportation, so I'll keep this one a bit short. Just as communities of today are primarily designed around the car, which became popular at the time of their construction, future communities could primarily be designed around public transportation and various forms of microtransit, such as e-cycles. This would save a gigantic amount of space that would today be taken up by roads, as things like cycle paths and railroads can occupy a smaller physical footprint while still providing adequate carrying capacity for trains and bikes respectively. This aids in increasing density, and the absence of cars will significantly reduce noise pollution, as other forms of transport are simply much quieter. Things like bikes should be universally accessible also to the public, and this could take the form of perhaps bike ranks that are scattered throughout the community. Earlier on I mentioned communities recycling minerals instead of importing virgin feedstocks for industries that require them, and this should apply to basically everything else as well. I'll talk about this in more detail in my next video, but in short, recycling in its current form under our current socio-economic system isn't working very well. However, in a society where overabundance isn't seen as a problem that drives down prices and makes things unsellable, but rather is seen as something to be celebrated, communities would likely recycle more types of materials and more stringently. Yes, including plastics. Propagating localized circular economies is something that can reduce our reliance on new resources, keep waste out of landfills, and provide people with an abundant supply of resources for various uses. The last thing I wanted to cover in this video, but certainly not the least important, is a little thing I like to call community infrastructure. This is something, or a collection of things, that facilitate collaboration, formation of social groups, and the propagation, and indeed maintenance, of a community fabric that unites people within said communities and aids community cohesion. This can take many forms, including sports clubs, maker/hobby spaces, public libraries, and other spaces that encourage people to cooperate, socialise, do things together, and share thoughts and ideas. These exist today, but often scattered around various places rather than being a core part of the community structure, which is more what I envision. This can and should even, in my view, include things that encourage people to share, such as communal allotments where people can share their produce and help others grow their own. This would likely take place in smaller communities that may not have vertical farms, or by people who simply love the practice of gardening. And that's one of the things I've talked about previously in my video Civic Design, where I envisioned a larger community as being made up of smaller groups, each specialising in a particular purpose, interest, lifestyle, etc. If we had it so that similar people can choose, without the limitations of money or markets, to congregate into areas where they live in close proximity to each other, that would go a long way in creating a deep sense of community. You could have an enclave of artists, of sports people, of role players, small communities specialised in catering to specific physical and mental needs, etc. With these measures and community infrastructure in place, communities of the future will be more connected and more capable of providing social needs, staving off loneliness, and providing people with a true sense of belonging. I think I've covered most things regarding future communities. There may be some details I missed and some topics I largely omitted, such as education, which requires a more thorough deliberation, and I will do the topic justice in another instalment. For now though, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you want to see more videos like this, but also want to hear about my research and development and my own little tinkering ideas, then why not subscribe and turn on the little notification bell. Sharing helps raise awareness of topics like these and also gives the channel a little bit of a bump. Thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you all in the next one.